From the time of a child's birth, and often even before that, parents are looking ahead and thinking ahead. Well, how can I help this child to be successful? And there are different areas that different people set their minds on. How sometimes parents are thinking, how can I make them a successful reader? And so they buy the CD, and a mother holds the speaker to her belly so the child can hear. In reality, the child can best hear her voice. We've learned as people have studied. How can I make my child a successful ball player? And so he comes out of the womb and there's a soccer ball or a mitt there and goes on his hand almost immediately. Just ways of showing that's what people are thinking of. I want them to be successful, and that process starts early. And our society is full of programs and organizations of helping to prepare and accelerate young people in learning and developing their skills in one way or another. And that's not all bad. But of all the things that are being thought ahead of time of how to make young people successful, who's calling attention to the importance of developing them into successful leaders? I wouldn't say there is no one. There's probably different organizations that either have some program, or maybe that's their mission statement, that's their purpose, is to help to develop the skills of leadership, especially in young people. And so maybe you could find some help with that, and maybe there are people helping to get parents' minds on thinking ahead in that particular area. But if there are organizations like that in our society, would you trust them? Do you trust the ideas and the priorities and the values that they would have that would, in their mind, produce someone to be a successful leader? Would you trust them that you drop their child off and you're going to let them fill your children's head and mind with ideas that are going to, if put into practice, would make your child a leader as those particular people envision it or define leadership to be? Maybe there are some who could be helpful. I'm sure there are some who would not be. Well, more important than that, what about who is it that would point your mind and the mind of parents to not just preparing your children to be leaders, but to be godly leaders? Because there is a difference, isn't there? This is important because your children today are going to grow up and they will follow. Everybody follows someone. And the majority of children are going to grow up and are going to lead in some way, in some form. There is someone that they are going to lead. And so are you thinking about how to prepare them, as of all the things you're thinking of what you want them to be prepared for, are you thinking of how to prepare them to be godly leaders? If they're going to primarily follow, they need to be able to identify a godly leader. And in whatever capacity and way that they are going to lead, now is the time to continue the training, if hopefully it's already started, of training them to be godly leaders. In every lesson like this, I often throw in this asterisk that this is not just a lesson for parents, because our children are influenced by more than just parents. Whether it's a matter of extended family, could go through and with practically everybody here, you influence my children. All of us influence one another. That's a part of why God has put us together and joined us together to be a church of Christ. Join us together to work with and help each other. And in some way, that includes as well our influence on children. So everybody here has some degree of influence on children. No matter how you may judge it to be small, what can you contribute in your degree of influence in helping young people to grow up to be godly leaders? This is important, but the first thing I want us to realize is godly leaders are not always trained to be godly leaders from their youth. They don't always have someone who had that goal in mind. We'll look at two examples of men who are known for their leadership. The first being Gideon. Look in Judges chapter 6. In verse 12, as God appears to him The angel of the Lord at least appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." Now, when you first read about Gideon, there's not much that shows him to be a mighty man of valor. Maybe this is more God saying what He is shaping him and molding him to become. But if he was or was going to be a mighty man of valor, was that because he had parents who had the goal of raising him to be that? Well, look at verse 13, and we start to get the answer. Gideon said to him, "Oh, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all His miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, Did not the Lord God bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." That's the descendants of Ishmael. I wonder, had Gideon here has these doubts, these questions. Had he talked to his father about them? Had his father helped to direct his mind and his thinking and his priorities in a way to be able to understand the leadership of God? Well, look at verses 25 and 26. And I don't know for sure if Gideon had asked, but if he had, I think we get an idea of the kind of leadership that was in his home. It came to pass the same night that the Lord said to him, to Gideon, "Take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this rock in the proper arrangement, and take the second bull and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image, which you shall cut down." So if he had asked his father, why are all these things happening if the Lord is with us? Or why has the Lord forsaken us? What kind of an answer is he going to get from a father who has built an altar and an image to Baal? So Gideon did not have this kind of leadership. In fact, judging by what God told him to do and the fact that he did it, and if you keep reading, you'll see Gideon actually ends up leading his father. And his father accepts that, at least to some degree. So Gideon didn't have that kind of an example. And then go over to Judges chapter 8 and verses 22 and 23. He didn't grow up with someone directing him in that way, as far as we can tell. But he eventually took on that role, and he became a great leader, not just of the nation, but within his family. Notice Judges 8, 22 and 23, what this says about the godly leadership, the godly leader that Gideon became. The men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." Think of all that was being offered to him, and what more could a man want than when he dies to know it will be his son, his grandson that will continue his legacy. Gideon wasn't interested in the legacy. Gideon gives an answer. Maybe he had heard of what Joshua said, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And so he rejects the crown that is offered to him. Gideon, without someone raising him to be a godly leader, became a godly leader. And then in Acts chapter 7, if we think about godly leaders, then we think of Moses. If we had a top 5 godly leaders, not just in the Bible, but in the history of mankind, Moses belongs there. And we learn about his childhood as Stephen summarizes the history of Israel. In Acts chapter 7, verses 20 and 21, it says, "At this time Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God. And he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son." I should have included 22. "And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds." Then Exodus 2, verse 10 also fills in a detail that Stephen just didn't give because of the nature of his lesson. Pharaoh's daughter took him away, he mentions, but of course within that time period he was taken to his mother who nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So we know what Moses became, especially in the area of leadership, But think about where he started. He had a good youth. He had 3 months with his parents, and then, though that was a stressful time for them, and then that was extended a little bit when Pharaoh's daughter found him, and then through Miriam's help, Moses' mother was able to care for him, I suppose, for a few years. So he had a good start, that he was spared, he had life, and then he was able to spend that with his godly parents. But Moses spent the majority of his youth in the court of the Egyptians. And as we think about his influence, we read in Acts 7 and verse 22, he was raised being taught and trained all the knowledge and the skills of the Egyptians. So whatever their values were, whatever their focus was on developing leaders, that's the kind of training that at least he saw, and presumably that he also received. So what was that influence? Without a detailed record, what do we know about his adopted grandfather? How would you like to have had a grandfather, even adopted, who by his own decree had intended that you would be killed? That was his grandfather. What about his father? Well, we don't know if Pharaoh's daughter ever had a husband. We're just not told. So what did Moses have in terms, who was his primary male influence? We don't know, but it was someone who shared the values typical of the Egyptians. So none of them, of course, were directing Moses to become a godly leader. Maybe a leader in some ways, but not a godly leader. He had no one. So Gideon and Moses show us that godly leaders were not always raised to be godly leaders, not always raised by godly parents. But, of course, that doesn't mean then that this is not important, since all of our children will follow someone someday. Then they need to know how to recognize a godly leader. And since most of our children will lead someone in some way at some point in the future, then they need to learn to be godly leaders. And children who have maybe the most rare blessing that's possible in this world, to have a father and a mother who love the Lord their God with their heart and soul and mind and strength, when that is in the heart of their parents, then if they are going to be brought up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, then those parents have the responsibility, you and I have that responsibility, to raise them with the goal of them becoming godly leaders. And so, of course, that means that parents have to think ahead in order to raise them with this focus. Look at Judges chapter 13 in verse 8. And if you're one to underline or mark or make a note in the front or back of your Bible, or in whatever way, there's sometimes a verse or a phrase that is worth finding at some other point. For me, this is one of those. Here we learn about the time where the news of the future birth of Samson was announced to his parents. And in verse 8, this is Samson's father. He prayed to the Lord and said, "O my Lord, please let the man of God whom you sent come to us again and teach us what we shall do for the child who will be born." That last phrase, teach us what we shall do for the child who will be born. This is what every parent needs to be saying from the first time they know there will be a child. And this is something that parents need to be, and whatever relationship to parents and children you have, this is something to pray about. This is something to say, whether you say it in exactly these words or some different. And in particular, to say this, something like this, in regards to godly leaders. God, what shall I do for the child so that they will grow up knowing what is involved in being a godly leader? What do I do, God? As you pray that, pray it also at a time where your children hear you pray that. Pray it in your bed and by yourself and with your spouse. But say it where your children hear you say it, so that they know not only that it is important because they know you serve God, but they hear it out of your mouth. That's another level of importance. and of communicating that to them. And so ask God for help. And then respond by making your own commitment to God. How am I going to raise a godly leader? It's going to begin with my own commitment to God. As Deuteronomy chapter 6 said, Moses reminded them, these things shall be in your heart, and then you teach them to your children. And so what's the best I can do to help my child become a godly leader? It's my own commitment to God. It's the confidence that I know Jesus is the Son of God, and I know what He came and what He did, and how I can receive the blessings that He came to offer. And so that's where it starts, of course. But then what are the commitments I need to make in order to begin getting my children to that place? Well, some of the commitments we could say are general, like Joshua, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Or as parents are told in Ephesians 6 and verse 4, to bring your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Those are not just good memory verses, but those are commitments to God. God, I want to raise godly children. And so we will serve you, and I will bring them up in your nurture and your admonition. Those are some good general statements to make and commitments to make. But then, of course, that's going to cover everything. I'm trying to hone my mind in on God. I'm trying to hone my mind in on how to help them be a godly leader. So how do I do that? Well, then there's some more specific things that I need to make the commitment to guide and direct and point my children in this direction. I'm not going to claim that I have the plan, but let me offer to you just a few examples of some specific commitments that parents need to make to God and to one another and to their children that will help lead them in the direction of becoming godly leaders. First of all, there needs to be consistent teaching that comes from the mouth of the Father. He should be a good leader in his example and in all ways, but the Father needs to be the one teaching his children. And the details of that are going to vary from family to family, how many days a week and how much time, and is that by just reading the Bible, or did he have some topic that he needs to pick out and talk to them about? I don't have the wisdom to detail all of that out, but in some way in your home, fathers, consistent with your ability, you need to do the teaching. Your children need to hear it come out of your mouth. But not just from the father. Mothers, your children need to be taught, they need to hear it from you. Because even if it's the same subject that your husband talked to them about and studied with them, if it's the same passages, you're not going to teach them anything contradictory, but the male brain and the female brain are known to have a few differences. They need to hear you say some of the same things in your own words. They need to hear it from you. And how you do that, and when you do that, and how often you do that, that's going to be a part of every family has to make those judgments. But consistently, fathers and mothers teach your children. That's a part of bringing them up to be godly leaders who will teach their children. You remember Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 9, even if you don't know that you do. 2 are better than 1. And give some examples, and then the end of that, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. If you want your children to be godly leaders, then work together. And I don't just mean cooperate and get along. First of all, I mean work. Work. And do so together. I say that because every society has its strengths and weaknesses. Among the weaknesses and challenges of our society is that families are split up and divided. They go in different directions. We don't have it so much here, but in many places, in order to get to your job, husband often is sitting in traffic 1 hour each direction. So out of his 24 hours in the day, 2 hours of those are spent in a vehicle apart from his family. And in a variety of ways, in the varying interests and activities and different involvements, often families are split up. I'm going here, she's going there, they're going somewhere else, and they're all going in different places. That can have a role, but if you're going to lead your children, you have to be with your children. Also emphasize the importance of work, because in my observation, work is less emphasized, and especially for younger people. And some of that is just because there's, in some ways, less for them to do. Starla and I have talked about this from the time, and maybe even before we had children, but there was a day and a time where there were some tasks related to the home that contributed to the home that the children were primarily responsible for. Today, many of those have been automated, and it's the machine does them. Well, I'm not saying throw your machines out and make your children do all of that work. I'm just saying, asking, what's the difference in a generation that grew up primarily from their youth having regular work and responsibility, if that was just a part of daily life? What's the difference in the effect of that and a generation that grows up that maybe had a little bit here or there, but not regular and consistent, and that the time that other generations spent working, that generation grew up watching television or other such things? Doesn't mean one is sinful, but I'm just asking you to think about what's the difference in children that grow up in one or the other. And so because often we don't have to work as much, then work is often less emphasized in our society today. And so work is important. And sometimes we have to work separately. And being together is important. Sometimes we play together. Both of those are good. If we work separately, some good things can be done. If we play together, some good things that can be done. If we work together, that's better than the other two. More will be accomplished, especially in this area, because when we're working together, then our children are seeing leadership. When we're on our own, then we're just guiding ourselves. When we're together, and on top of that, when we're working together, then there are obviously going to be decisions that have to be made by someone, and the children are going to see how the parents work together and how we lead them. And as we work together, they're learning about godly leadership. Make the commitment that my home is going to be a place of worship. Another area where a weakness in our society, where the church is sometimes just thought of that, the church is really the leader of worship. That's not the case. And even more so in some parts of our society where the building is viewed as holy. That's a holy space, a holy place. Sometimes it's even called a sanctuary, and that implies it's a holy place. No, this is not a holy place. This is a place where we can worship. Your home needs to be a place where there is worship. What was the first thing that Noah did in Genesis 8 and verse 20 when they came off of the ark? Maybe first I should have asked, how many things do you think Noah had to do when he came off of the ark? You think you've got a long list of to-dos. After having been on that ark for over a year, what's on the honey-do list of Noah? Well, what's the first thing that he does? At least the first thing that we are told, Genesis 8 and verse 20, he builds an altar and they worship. What was the occasion? I suppose at least part of it was rejoicing. We're happy. We're finally off of this ark, and we can begin to live our lives again. And so happy occasions, joyful occasions. Our society knows how to have a reason to celebrate and have a party and have a holiday. That's good, that's fine. But in your home, when there's a reason to rejoice, that's a reason to worship, among other things. And then Paul and Silas, though not a family, again, more in the context of private worship, when they are thrown into prison in Philippi, what are they doing there while they're miserable, or could have been miserable? Their feet and their hands are in stocks. They're singing and they're praying. What should we be doing in our home when the day, the week, the month, the year is miserable for one reason or another, doesn't mean it's the only thing. One of the things we should be doing is worshiping. When that happens, because it happens, somebody has initiated it, someone is leading. Parents, lead your children in private worship. Of course, in public worship. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, these new Christians, they continued steadfastly. They made a commitment to God and to each other, and they were consistent in that commitment. And so they continued steadfastly in the apostles' teaching and fellowship and the breaking of bread and in prayers. And so while usually I read that verse and I think about the new Christians and the new church, but that's the fruit, that's the product of homes. Fathers and mothers who made the commitment. There's lots of things that we can do, and the Jewish schedule and family as well was typically the seventh day of the week was a day of rest, but the first day of the week was a day for work and for other things. Well, now those priorities change. And so now godly leaders have to kind of reset their schedule. Well, we were going to take a class, we were going to go to this place, we were going to have this commitment. Well, now we're not going to have those things as a priority on the first day of the week. Children had to learn. And how many questions do you think children were asking before that day of Pentecost and in the weeks following when life changed in many ways? And so in Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, there are godly leaders in the home, and there are children who are learning from that, and your children will learn from that as well. If you're there in Acts chapter 2, drop down to verse 46. The life of these new Christians did not revolve exclusively or only around the assembly of the church. That was for a temporary time their daily practice. What we would say is they were having a gospel meeting, as we're going to in a few weeks. So they were continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. How did they meet from house to house? It wasn't everyone. There were 3,000 people and counting. There were people who were opening their homes. There were invitations that were given. Come into our home. That's leadership. And children are involved in that. Open your home. What did the children who were in these homes, either as hosts or who were invited, what could you imagine were some of the conversations that were had by these new Christians? And as the adults primarily, maybe have these conversations, what things were children hearing and overhearing from the adults? And if that same thing happened today, would the children have heard anything, or would they have been on their phones and watching a movie? Sometimes that's how they learn. It's indirect sometimes. It's what they overhear. And opening your home and having people together is an opportunity for children to learn as well. And then one other, you make up your own list of what your commitments are going to be, but one of them needs to be, I'm not going to be too busy to do these things. This is a weakness of our society because of the luxury of our society. We have so many choices, we have so many options, so many places to go, people to see, programs and activities that are not always unimportant. They can be important, but are they more important or less important than these? I think we can sort that out pretty easily. And so Romans 12 verse 2 reminds us, do not be conformed to this world. Don't imitate the thinking and the habits and the schedule of the world, because the world is missing a whole set of priorities and goals that we have, so we can't just follow. We may be able to observe and borrow a few good ideas from the world in a general way, not in the sinful sense. But again, some of the activities in our society, they're not all sinful, but which of the activities of our society that fill the schedules and the mind and the pocketbooks of our society, or empty their pocketbooks, are more important than these? Don't let the things of lesser importance take priority over the things of greater importance. The parable of the sower, you remember the weeds and the thorns. Matthew 13, I think verse 22, Luke chapter 8 and verse 14. And what that is the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, the pleasures of this life. That doesn't have to be sinful. Parents in our culture, in our society, many times it's the parents who plant the seeds of the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, the pleasures of this life. That's what the home revolves around. That's what the home schedule revolves around, to the neglect of these things. And so children have grown up with those seeds being planted and watered and fed and nourished and nurtured. So the children grow up, and that's what the children want to do, is have fun all the time, because that's what was most important in my family. Having fun all the time, or whatever it may be, or making money all the time. So the children have those roots are already pretty well developed, much more deeply than these things. I'm not saying don't do some of those things. I'm just saying don't be too busy. Make the commitment, because you set your schedule. You make the commitment, I'm not going to be too busy with these other things and not able to do these things. So you work that out in your home, in those details, but you make the commitment to God, both of a general and of a specific nature, if your goal is to lead your children to become godly leaders. And then turn to the book of Proverbs. Also recognize the importance of seeking the help of others. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 1 says, "A man who isolates himself seeks his own desire. He rages against all wise judgment." Of course, first of all, work with your husband and work with your wife in the process of working towards training and teaching your children. But don't even stop there. Seek out other godly parents, or especially those who would be older, and you can see by their decisions, by their children's lives, you can see that they had this priority. You can see there was wisdom that was shared. Seek out their help. As opposed to isolating ourselves. Proverbs 27 and verse 17, "As iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend." That should happen between husbands and wives, but that can also happen between families and other families, seeking help, seeking wisdom in the process of decisions and sorting out those decisions. Seek the help of other parents. And who do I seek help from? Sometimes our parents or our grandparents, sometimes we have decisions that they didn't have to make. And so sometimes seek the help of others who are your peers, maybe have or recently had children your age, and seek out their help. How did they work through the kinds of decisions, and maybe they're currently working through the same kinds of decisions that you are. Seek help from them. And the rate of change in our society means sometimes we're making decisions previous generations did not. But look for parents, other parents who have the same goals that you have, and let iron sharpen iron. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 29. It says, "The glory of young men is their strength, and the splendor of old men is their gray head." There's also the danger, especially in our society, of thinking, well, because I have decisions and challenges that my parents, my grandparents didn't have, well, they don't know how to help us with that, and so we've just got to figure this out on our own. Well, we may face some decisions that they didn't, but they faced some decisions that we didn't. And in the process of time, the way they got those gray hairs was probably from you. And in the course of that, they learned some things that you haven't learned yet. And so don't ignore and lose the opportunity of what previous generations have to offer. But talk to them and work together with them. We all are learning from others. Are we going to be the fool who isolates ourselves and pretend we're not learning from others. We are. Or are we going to seek out godly parents, others who can help us? Or are we going to seek that kind of help from the world? Parents have to think ahead. Who will your helpers be? And then last, how can I train my children, raise my children, show my children, teach my children to be godly leaders? I don't know that there's a top one answer to that, but certainly a big part of it, turn to John chapter 10, is fathers, be a leader. That's how you raise them. To be a leader, you be a leader. Mothers, you be a leader. That's how you lead them. Are fathers leaders? Of course they are. Ephesians 6 and verse 4 is directed specifically, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Are mothers leaders? Of course they are. What is said of the woman of Proverbs 31 and verse 27, she watches over the ways of her household. That's not just an observer, that's an overseer. She's overseeing the ways of her household, especially her children. Now, when our world hears fathers be leaders, then they make all kinds of false accusations and claims and assumptions. You're just trying to promote a patriarchal society. And when our society hears mothers lead, they make all kinds of false claims and accusations and assumptions as well. Because our society does not understand the value of the leadership that God has given to mothers. That's illustrated by the fact that especially in our children's youth, God typically is giving mothers far more time with the children than the fathers. In their youth, the primary influence of a mother is much stronger than that of a father. And that's exhausting, but it's influence, it's leadership, and that's the way that God, in typical circumstances, designed it to work. And so, how could I summarize the kind of leader that a father and mother need to be? Turn to John chapter 10. I want to look, as I have in previous lessons, on different aspects of leading. Just briefly at John 10 and John 13 and Psalm 23. What can we learn from John in John chapter 10? This is where Jesus presents himself as the good shepherd, as the good leader. And while this isn't specifically a parenting passage, it's a leadership passage. In John chapter 10 and verse 10, the thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they may have life and that they may have it abundantly. And so fathers and mothers, are you leading your children to life? And what did Jesus mean by life that was abundant? Well, figure it out and then be sure that's what you're leading your children to have. What does it mean to live abundantly? Our society has an idea, not what Jesus was talking about. In verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. Fathers, would you be willing to die for your children? I imagine the majority of fathers and everyone here would say yes. Well then, if you're willing to give your life, what else are you willing to give up? Are you willing to live and to give up things that in the past were important to you in your pastimes and your priorities? Are you willing to change those for the benefit of your children? In verse 18, Jesus says, no one takes it from me, his life. I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father. Jesus was a leader. Here describes himself as a shepherd. Can a leader accept the leadership of others? Jesus did. He's the perfect example of that. He was this good shepherd, but he says, I've received a command from my Father. And in the home, a good shepherdess can sacrificially lead her children and at the same time submit herself to her husband, as the rest of the Bible teaches. There's an order of leadership in the home, and those who lead can at the same time be led. That's God's plan for the home, and that's where children see and observe and hear godly leadership. Go over a few pages to John chapter 13, where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. Not specifically written for parents, but in part written for parents. Verse 6, where Jesus comes to Peter, and Peter says, "Oh no, Lord, you're not washing my feet." And then he goes in just a minute to the other, "Oh, well, Lord, wash me all, everything. Wash me." And Jesus says, "Well, you don't understand now, but you'll understand later." Parents, you ever said something like that? You don't understand now? Of course. Your children will not always understand, agree with, like your decisions about work, about who our closest friendships are going to be, what we're going to participate in, what we're not going to participate in. They're not going to understand it, like it, always agree with it. So what are you going to do? Your father and mother, you're going to be a leader. In verse 4, as the disciples saw Jesus gird himself with a towel and go and wash each of their feet. Fathers, do your children see you serving them? Do your children see you fathers serving their mother, serving your wife in some way that is akin to Jesus washing their feet? Because the disciples were learning about leadership, and Jesus made that clear in the words that he spoke to them. In verse 14, Jesus said, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." In the home, mothers wash feet and everything else, don't they? And in the process, they are not teaching their children, "Well, I wash your feet and everything else because I'm your slave, I'm your servant, and you lead me because you tell..." No, just the opposite. Implicitly, but then good leaders also tell them, children are learning, I'm your mother and I'm serving you because I am your leader. And the end of verse 14, as I'm doing for you, you do the same thing for each other. And we'll serve other homes and other families. And one day, you're a father, you're a mother, you're going to serve your family. Mothers are teaching, you ought also to wash one another's feet. And then last, Psalm 23. You could, based on what you remember of it, or if you want to turn to it. But what is said there about the good shepherd? "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me. He restores my soul. He is with me. You comfort me. You walk with me through the valleys. You prepare a table. You anoint my head with oil." And all of that is aimed towards, verse 6, dwelling in my house forever. This part of this is written as though it were from the perspective of the sheep. Here's what the sheep would say about the shepherd, as well as what the sheep in the parallel say to the shepherd. And so, shepherds, fathers, what would your children say about your leadership? And if they're too young to really do that now, in 10 years, what are they going to be saying? In 20 years, what are they going to be saying? When they have their own children, what are they going to be saying about your leadership? If they have their own children, are they going to look back at your leadership and say, "I have an example to follow"? Or are they going to look back at your leadership and say, "I remember what my father did and I'm going to do the opposite"? And I've never read Psalm 23 and thought about a shepherdess. But that's what a mother in the home is, a shepherdess. And that's what godly mothers are. And so mothers, sometime read 23rd Psalm to learn and to remind yourself of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Why did the shepherd lead them to the pastures and to the water and through the valley? It's the end of verse 6. He was leading them to dwell in the Lord's house forever. Why do you do what you do as a mother? It's to lead them to the Lord's house forever, and every decision you make revolves around and connects to that. Sometime read Psalm 23 and then read the end of Proverbs 31. And maybe you'll see a few dots connect that are just in the nature of leadership. Read that and praise mothers who have done well, because when God shows us what a godly leader is, and then when godly mothers do that, God is praising them, and they deserve that from us as well. And so parents, you are raising followers. Teach your children to recognize who to follow. And most, if not all of us, are raising leaders in one way or another in the future. If your children one day become the kind of leader that you are, will you be pleased in what you see in them? Will God be pleased with the leaders that our children are becoming and will become? And who is your leader? Open your songbooks, number 272. Who is your leader? God is, whether you like it or not, but whose leadership have you accepted? And if you are here this morning knowing that you are outside of Christ and the blessings of the fellowship that He has offered through Jesus Christ, then I urge you to turn to Him, to repent of your sins in confidence that Jesus is the Christ and the Son of God. Confess that faith with your own mouth and be baptized into Christ and the blood of His Son. The blood of Christ will wash away your sins. As a Christian, if you need to return to your leader, then do so first in your own heart. But if our prayers will help you in some way in doing that, think about that need and tell us how we could help. And let's each of us sing this song with the determination that we will follow the Good Shepherd to our home. If we can help you in doing that in any way, come forward as we stand and sing.